Number 5. The Andrea Doria. Built in Genoa, Italy during the 1950s, the 701.5-foot-long luxury cruise ship SS Andrea Doria was the country's largest, fastest, and safest passenger vessel when it first hit the seas. But in January 1956, less than 4 years after entering service, she collided with the Swedish ocean liner MS Stockholm off the Nantucket coast amid heavy fog. The ship slowly began to list as she took on water, and 11 hours later, she slipped completely beneath the waves. She came to rest along the border of a continental shelf at a depth of 240 feet. Although 46 people tragically perished in the disaster, 1,600 survived thanks to the vessel's slow sinking, as well as the effective response and rescue effort that ensued. As of 2017, at least 16 people have died visiting the Andrea Doria wreck, including experienced scuba divers. Some have even come to call it the Everest of shipwrecks, alluding to how it's considered a major achievement to visit, a testament to the willingness among the divers to risk their lives to put the accomplishment under their belts. Despite the high number of fatalities, visitors continue to flock to the wreck due to its legendary status, as well as rumors that it contains a large amount of money and valuables. The deaths have been attributed to numerous causes, including the strain that the water's pressure and cold temperature put on the human body. Rising to the surface too quickly can cause a deadly condition known as the bends, and at such an extreme depth, an equipment malfunction can easily prove deadly. It's also speculated that some divers become disoriented while inside the wreck, where visibility is poor and currents can change with little to no warning. The wreck is also dangerous due to its deteriorating condition. While it remained pristine for some time after it sank, it's actively decayed for many years now. But none of these hazards are enough to stop those who are determined to acquire the bragging rights that come with diving to the Andrea Doria wreck. Number 4. SS Valencia. After serving as a troop ship in the Spanish-American War, the iron-hulled passenger steamer SS Valencia resumed its regular passenger service along the U.S. West Coast between San Francisco and Alaska. However, the 252-foot-long vessel had fallen out of favor among customers due to its outdated design, small size, and vulnerability to the elements. Navigating poorly during winter and slower than modern ships, the Valencia had also gained a reputation for carrying an excessive number of passengers, which raised safety concerns. The Valencia had encountered several accidents before its ill-fated final voyage. In 1902, it collided with another ship, puncturing its hull. Fortunately, the damage was above the waterline, preventing a catastrophic outcome. 3 years later, though, it ran aground in Alaska, but luckily there were no injuries. Becoming a backup vessel after these incidents, the unpopular Valencia set sail on January 26, 1906 from San Francisco with 9 officers, 56 crew members, and 108 passengers aboard. The ship encountered severe weather conditions that night, making celestial navigation impossible and forcing the crew to rely on dead reckoning. Tragically, the vessel struck rocks in Canadian waters, causing a significant breach in the hull before being lifted off the reef by a massive wave. With water flooding the ship, the captain deliberately grounded it to avoid immediate sinking. The Valencia came to rest just 300 feet from the shore. Amid chaos and panic, the lifeboats were mishandled, leading to 3 of them capsizing while being lowered into the water. 2 other lifeboats also capsized and 1 disappeared without a trace. As the Valencia broke apart and was battered by the waves, many passengers were swept into the sea, desperately clinging to debris while nearby ships' crews helplessly looked on. Of the 12 men who managed to reach the shore, 3 were tragically washed back out and lost their lives. The remaining 9 survivors sought refuge in a cabin, where they were eventually rescued. Around the same time, a lifeboat with 8 skeletons on board was reported by the wife of a New Channel fisherman. But the treacherous conditions prevented recovery attempts. Several other people also reported similar sightings in the following months. Survivors of the disaster shared chilling stories of witnessing a phantom ship trailing behind them while they were transported to Seattle on another vessel. This ghostly ship eerily resembled the Valencia and seemed to sail directly toward the same rocks where the tragic sinking occurred. The ghost ship allegedly signaled to their vessel but didn't cause any further incidents. In 1910, sailors reported seeing a ship resembling the Valencia near Pachina Point, the area where the ship sank. Such sightings and tales of skeleton-filled lifeboats have persisted for over a century, adding to the mysterious legacy of the Valencia. The wreckage of the ship can still be seen to this day, drawing curious visitors and keeping the haunting stories alive. Number 3. MV Salem Express. The roll-on, roll-off passenger vessel MV Salem Express experienced a series of troubling incidents that began even before she entered service in 1967. In 1966, her maiden voyage under the name Fred Scamaroni was delayed by an engine room fire. After repairs, though, she began operating along her first route between the French cities of Marseille and Ajaccio in June of that year. The ferry experienced her first collision the following year in 1967, and 3 years after that, a fire broke out during a voyage to the French commune of Bastia. Then, a decade later, in 1980, the Salem Express ran aground, but she remained in service, and in 1988 she was sold to the Egypt-based Samatur Shipping Company, who renamed her the Salem Express and operated her along the route between Suez, Egypt, and Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. The vessel's worst and final mishap came in 1991, while sailing from Jeddah to the Egyptian port town of Safaga. After being delayed for 2 days due to mechanical issues, the Salem Express departed from Saudi Arabia during a heavy storm. Along what would have been otherwise probably an ordinary journey, the ship deviated from her usual route. She ran aground along a coral reef less than 10 miles off the Egyptian shore, ripping its bow door open and causing seawater to rapidly flood into the car deck. It took just 20 minutes for the Salem Express to sink with hundreds of passengers trapped aboard, but the exact number of deaths is unknown due to conflicting news reports and claims. According to the official record, there were 644 casualties, but other sources have put the number as high as 850. Either way, the number of people who drowned is a lot higher than 180 who survived. In the initial aftermath of the disaster, reports claimed that the vessel drifted off course amid high winds. Investigators found no evidence of wrongdoing on behalf of the captain, but allegations later arose that he deviated from the normal route and took an unauthorized turn. This theory was backed up by several crew members who said that the captain was in a hurry, and the fact that he was known for taking shortcuts raised even more suspicions. The Salem Express wreck sits at a depth of 105 feet below the water surface. It's a controversial dive site due to the especially tragic nature of the disaster, and because the victims' belongings remain scattered along the sea floor. Human remains have also been spotted among the wreck, even though that there was an effort to recover as many bodies as possible. While visiting the wreck is permitted, a lot of local guides refuse out of respect for the lost lives and the impact the disaster had on the local community. Many visitors to the wreck have reported feeling unsettled afterwards, and one diver even claimed to hear voices during his experience. Would you visit the Salem Express or another wreck that met a similar fate? Or do you think it's best just to let the sunken ship and its victims rest in peace? Let us know what you think in the comments down below, and while you're at it, subscribe to the channel. Number 2. The Patriot. Theodosia Burr Alston was the daughter of the disgraced 3rd U.S. Vice President Aaron Burr, who you've definitely heard of if you've seen the musical Hamilton. Theodosia's husband, Joseph Alston, was also South Carolina's governor during the War of 1812. Shortly after Joseph Alston was sworn into his position, Theodosia set sail for New York aboard a schooner called the Patriot. At the time, she was suffering from some health issues caused by the anguish she experienced after her son's death. Theodosia was on her way to visit her father, who'd recently returned from Europe. And because her husband was busy with his political commitments, she was accompanied by a man named Timothy Green, who had some medical knowledge in case the need for it arose during the voyage. The Patriot departed from South Carolina on New Year's Eve, with plans for a swift journey north to unload a cargo of spoils from privateering raids. At the time, the famously fast ship's name had been painted over and her guns had been hidden below deck. No major problems were expected, yet the Patriot was never seen or heard from again after it left port. Among the rumors that flew in the wake of the vessel's disappearance was the suspicion that the Patriot had been captured by a pirate. Refusing to believe that his daughters had fallen captive to pirates, Aaron Burr resigned to the theory that the Patriot had wrecked with fatal consequences. And over the following decades, more theories surfaced as researchers worked to solve the mystery of the vessel's disappearance. Many speculated that the Patriot had wrecked near Cape Hatteras off North Carolina, an area that remains infamous to this day for its hazardous conditions. It's also been theorized that the vessel may have been lured into the area by pirates, who deliberately wrecked and raided ships. One way they did this was by walking a horse up and down the coast with a lantern around its neck. A passing ship's crew would see the light bobbing up and down and mistake it for a safely anchored vessel. While traveling in that direction, however, the ship would wreck on the shoals, and pirates would proceed to plunder it. There's also been speculation that everyone aboard the Patriot was murdered, and there are varying versions of the pirate-related legends surrounding the ship's disappearance. But nobody knows which, if any, of these stories are the true version, or if the Patriot met some other fate. Number 1. The Mary Celeste. Built in Nova Scotia, Canada in the mid-19th century, the 103-foot-long Mary Celeste was a two-masted merchant vessel called a brigantine. In 1867, she ran aground during a storm and was abandoned by her original owners. And from there, she fell into American hands and proceeded to undergo a major refit. In late 1872, the Mary Celeste set sail from New York Harbor for Genoa, Italy, under the command of Captain Benjamin S. Briggs. Also traveling aboard the ship were his wife Sarah and their young daughter and 8 crew members. Back then, the telegraph didn't exist. There was no communication between ships unless they were within sight of each other. So there was typically no way to know that something went wrong along a ship's voyage until it failed to show up at its destination. Several weeks after the Mary Celeste departed from New York, the captain of a British brigantine called the Dei Gratia spotted the vessel moving erratically in choppy seas at full sail, roughly 400 miles east of the Azores. Nobody could be seen on deck, and the Dei Gratia captain's signals went unanswered. When some of Dei Gratia's crew members boarded the Mary Celeste, they discovered that it was completely empty. A lifeboat was missing, and the hold was flooded with several feet of water, but the ship was otherwise undamaged, and it was stocked with 6 months' worth of provisions. There were no obvious signs of anything going majorly wrong, and the last entry in Mary Celeste's logbook was dated 9 days earlier. By all appearances, the ship had been evacuated in an orderly fashion. But to this day, nobody knows why, and the fate of everyone aboard remains a mystery. Rumors whispered about the possibilities of an alcohol-fueled mutiny, violence between the crew members, and an insurance scam. But when the Dei Gratia towed the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar, investigators found no signs of foul play. At the time of Mary Celeste's recovery, maritime law dictated that a salvor could receive a generous cut of the assessed value of a rescued vessel and its cargo. So, a judge who oversaw the Dei Gratia owner's salvage claim begrudgingly awarded the vessel's captain with 1/5 of the total value of the Mary Celeste and her cargo. Number 8. Heinrich Bathurst. Heinrich Bathurst was a German flying ace who served valiantly in the Luftwaffe during World War II. While fighting on the Eastern Front for the first 2 years of his career, he shot down at least 50 enemy aircraft. Most German aces fought exclusively against Soviet soldiers, and those who saw battle on the Western Front had a relatively short average lifespan compared to those battling in the East. Bathurst was one of those few exceptions. After getting moved over to the West, he was one of just a few German pilots who quickly racked up kills. Throughout the summer of 1942 alone, he garnered 73 victories in the Mediterranean. 14 of the planes he shot down were P-38 Lightnings, which were a formidable and often deadly force when up against German pilots. Toward the end of 1944, Bathurst was only 2 kills away from the 100 mark. The day before Christmas Eve, he and several other pilots took off on a mission to intercept a raid in Bonn, Germany. He shot down an American P-47 Thunderbolt. This marked what would have been his 99th and final kill. Bathurst mysteriously vanished after that and remained missing for the next 24 years. In 1968, his Messerschmitt aircraft was discovered buried in soft mud in a wooded part of Germany. His remains were still inside the cockpit, and his wedding ring was even found tucked inside his glove, finally solving the mystery of his tragic fate. He was buried in Germany after being officially identified not long after. Number 7. Louise Pietrowicz. In what would eventually become one of Long Island's longest-running missing persons cases, 38-year-old Louise Pietrowicz took all of the money out of her bank account and vanished in October 1966. At the same time, she was unhappy in her marriage and was last seen driving away from her family's farm in Sagaponack with her boyfriend and the man she was having an affair with, a married police officer named William P. Boken. At the time, Louise had a young daughter, Sandy, who knew her mom would never abandon her by choice. But no remains were ever found, no arrests were made, and while rumors occasionally circulated, Louise's disappearance was eventually forgotten. In 2017, over 50 years after Louise went missing, the Suffolk Times published an extensive report on her case, sparking a renewed interest among the public and catching law enforcement's attention. Detectives reopened the case, and in early 2018, they located Louise's skeletal remains in the basement of a property in the town of Southold. The home was once owned by Boken, Louise's affair partner. The discovery was made thanks to a tip from Boken's wife, who told authorities that a body was buried somewhere beneath the house shortly after Louise's disappearance. Without naming names, a law enforcement agent said that sometimes witnesses come forward years or even decades after a crime is committed, sometimes out of guilt and sometimes because they finally feel safe sharing the information they know. Boken died in 1982, and the house was sold several years before that. His wife and children had no contact with him during the last 14 years of his life, and he was buried in a pauper's grave after no one claimed his body. Police had already searched the basement on a previous occasion and found nothing of importance, but they had better luck this time after new information prompted them to search a different area of the space. After breaking through the concrete floor and digging about 7 feet, investigators discovered Louise's skeleton. DNA testing confirmed the identity of the body, confirming Sandy's suspicion that her mom never chose to leave her on purpose. Number 6. Ishinosuke Uwano. It's extremely rare for a missing soldier to somehow turn up alive years after a war, let alone decades. But this was actually the case for a man named Ishinosuke Uwano, one of the roughly 400 Japanese servicemen who lived in the Soviet Union after World War II. In almost every one of those cases, those who didn't make it back home eventually died in forced labor camps. When Uwano failed to come back to Japan after his last confirmed sighting in the USSR's Sakhalin Island in 1958, his family just assumed he died. In 2000, Uwano was declared legally dead. They were shocked to find out 5 years later that he was alive and well, living in Ukraine, where he raised a family of his own. It's unclear how Uwano ended up settling down in Ukraine, and he declined to go into too many details, but he did say that his reasons for not returning to Japan had something to do with the former Soviet regime. In other words, Soviet officials probably refused to let him leave the country. The news that Uwano was alive came after he reached out to the Japanese embassy in Ukraine to see if it was possible for him to return to his homeland. A crew of Japanese workers were dispatched to Ukraine, where, to everyone's shock, they confirmed Uwano was who he claimed to be. In 2006, he visited Japan and reunited with his 2 sisters for the first time since 1943. It was his first time speaking Japanese in about 60 years. He stayed there for 10 days as a visiting tourist who was now officially a Ukrainian citizen. Little is known about what's been going on in Uwano's life after the tearful family reunion, but he reportedly passed away back in 2013 around the age of 90. Number 5. Lawrence E. Dixon. During World War II, 27 members of a unit consisting of highly skilled Black American pilots called the Tuskegee Airmen went missing in action. One of them was a 24-year-old captain named Lawrence E. Dixon, who vanished while escorting a reconnaissance plane the day before Christmas Eve back in 1944. About an hour after Dixon took off the runway and started heading for Prague from his base in southern Italy, he made a call on the radio and said he was having engine trouble. One of his wingmen, Lieutenant Robert L. Martin, later told the Washington Post that Dixon had to turn the plane back toward base. He crashed while searching for a spot to land or bail, and his fellow crew members lost sight of him in the process. The young pilot never made it home from his mission. When months passed without any word from her husband, Dixon's wife Phyllis wrote to the War Department in hopes of finding him. She waited patiently in hopes that he would be found, but it never happened. Finally, in 2018, 73 years after Dixon's disappearance, the U.S. Defense POW MIA accounting agency confirmed that human remains were located at a crash site in Austria, and they belonged to Dixon. The crash site was discovered by DPAA analyst Joshua Frank based on records describing a downed aircraft near the country's border with Germany. During a visit to the site, Frank confirmed that the aircraft was the same type Dixon was flying, a P-51 nicknamed Pagan. It was inside a crater and covered by moss. Frank said that the site was still littered with ash, and the surrounding trees had bore marks and scars from when the plane crashed and erupted into flames. Dixon's remains were recovered from the wreck, making him the first Tuskegee Airman to be positively identified, and most likely the first to be found since the war ended. Dixon's 76-year-old daughter Marla Andrews was overwhelmed by the news. At her request, her father's remains were transported home and buried at Arlington National Cemetery. How would you react if a loved one you thought was gone forever was miraculously found? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the video. At number 4, Alfred Swinscoe. In 1967, a 54-year-old British miner named Alfred Swinscoe mysteriously vanished into thin air after a night out drinking at a pub in the village of Pinxton. The last known sighting of him happened outside the bar that night. He said he was going to use the restroom and never came back, leaving his 6 children and his family shocked and speechless. 56 years later, in 2023, human remains were found in a field in Nottinghamshire. After hearing a description of the skeleton's size and clothes, Swinscoe's 60-year-old grandson, Russell Lowbridge, contacted law enforcement with his suspicion that the remains belonged to his grandfather. Lowbridge's hunch was correct. The skeleton was of Alfred Swinscoe. But this only solved one piece of the puzzle. Based on the injuries to his remains, a medical examiner concluded that Swinscoe was murdered. The next question for investigators was why someone killed the miner, and if possible, who was responsible. While it's doubtful that the killer is still alive, having some long overdue answers could help the family finally put the matter to rest. After Swinscoe's remains were positively identified, Lowbridge told the press that his grandfather's disappearance tormented his uncle Gary, who was with Swinscoe the night he went missing. Gary unfortunately died in 2012, never knowing what happened to his father. For now, authorities hope that anyone who knew Swinscoe or has information comes forward. Any extra hint could be what it takes to help crack the case. At number 3, Mateo Sabag. U.S. Army Master Sergeant Mateo Sabag went missing while serving in Vietnam back in 1970. He was in the armed forces for 24 years and was about to go home to the U.S. when he vanished. Unsure of whether he made it back to the U.S. or if he went missing overseas, the Army listed Sabag as a deserter. While his family was just as confused as everyone else regarding his sudden disappearance, they knew that he wouldn't have abandoned his military duties after almost a quarter century of service. They campaigned for a change on his record, and the Army later changed Sabag's status from AWOL to dead. His name was then put on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. And in 1995, Vietnam returned human remains to the U.S. that its government said belonged to Sabag. The next year, in 1996, 26 years after he went missing, a disheveled and disoriented elderly man claiming to be Sabag applied for Social Security benefits at a government office in Chattanooga. A representative from the agency told the man that Sabag was actually dead, but he didn't believe it. He didn't have any identifying documents to back up his claim. Instead, he referred the representative to his brother in Hawaii, who he said could confirm who he was. The military finally identified him through fingerprints, and investigators had no clue how and why Sabag stayed under radar for so many years. They were hesitant to relabel Sabag as a deserter and told the press that the military planned to treat him with respect as they worked to answer these questions surrounding his reappearance. Since Sabag was never properly discharged, the Army had to follow the necessary protocols. They returned him to active duty so they could start the process of formally discharging him. Authorities determined that Sabag was taken in by a family in California after his return to the States. He spent at least 10 years living in Rossville, Georgia, under the name Bobby Fernandez. He worked as a live-in caregiver for an elderly woman. In 1993, 3 years before he went to the Social Security Administration and applied for benefits, and the same year his name was added to the Veterans Memorial, he went to his local police with concerns that he was labeled an AWOL soldier. The police reportedly looked into the matter and told Sabag that it wasn't possible for him to be who he said he was, since that person was listed as dead. Sabag was eventually given an honorable discharge from the Army. He spent his last few years living in Hawaii near his family, where he supported himself with a military pension until his death in 2007. Number 2. Fishermen find castaway uncle. While on a fishing trip in the Pacific Ocean back in 2011, 2 men from Kiribati had their navigation system break down. 53-year-old Uwain Baranabue and 26-year-old Temei Tontake drifted for about 33 days before finally washing ashore on a remote atoll called Namdrik in the Marshall Islands. The men were grateful to have found dry land, but they were shocked to cross paths with descendants of their uncle, Bairo Tontake, who also went missing during a fishing trip about 60 years earlier during the 1950s. Bairo was presumed dead, but it turned out he had come ashore in the same island his nephews arrived at decades later. Stranded 350 miles from Kiribati with no way of getting home, Bairo made a new life for himself on Namdrik, where he was welcomed with open arms into the community. While his loved ones thought he was dead, he married a local woman, raised a family, and lived the rest of his days on the island. By the time the young men landed on Namdrik, their uncle had already passed away. When they arrived, a local took them to the only person on the island who still spoke their language, a living descendant of Bairo. The long-running family mystery was finally put to rest, bringing renewed hope to others whose family members never came back from being out at sea, which apparently happens on a regular basis there. Number 1. Arthur David Melvin. Less than 15 years after moving to Calgary, Alberta from Scotland in the early 20th century, Arthur Davidson Melvin volunteered to serve in World War I with the 56th Infantry Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. He went to Europe in 1916 and eventually transferred to the 31st Infantry Battalion. Melvin went missing in April 1917 at 29 years old while his unit fought to hold the French village of Thélus during the Battle of Arras. He was later presumed dead, but the whereabouts of his body remained a mystery until a century later. In 2019, an international collective called the Commonwealth War Graves Commission contacted Canadian officials with the possible location of Melvin's grave at the Bois Carré British Cemetery in Thélus. Experts positively confirmed the identity of the remains in 2021, marking one less among the 11,000 missing soldiers listed on the Canadian National Vimy Memorial in France.
Australia and World War II. Australia officially entered World War II on September 3, 1939, accepting Great Britain's declaration of war on Nazi Germany. The country subsequently entered a state of war with other Axis powers, including the Kingdom of Italy in June of 1940 and the Empire of Japan on December 9, 1941, 2 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Throughout the conflict, around 1 million Australians served in the armed forces in the European theatre, the North African Campaign and the Pacific Theatre. But the country itself remained untouched by combat until May 31, 1942, when a fleet of Japanese midget submarines attacked Sydney Harbour. Until then, Australia seemed like it was a safe distance from the fighting that was going on almost everywhere else in the world. The attack on Sydney Harbour and the series of attacks that followed over the next 9 days served as a sobering reminder that almost no human-populated corner of the globe would remain entirely untouched by combat. Japanese conquest in the Pacific. After the infamous bombing of Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941, Japan sought to expand its targets throughout the Pacific. They embarked on a large-scale offensive with a similar ferocity and relentlessness to the German blitzkrieg that had devastated parts of the West. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, the Philippine capital of Manila, the Malaysian capital of Kuala Lumpur, and Hong Kong had all fallen to the Japanese. In January 1942, Imperial forces overtook an Australian garrison at Rabaul in Papua New Guinea. By late February, the Japanese had barreled their way into multiple other territories, including the Solomon Islands, Burma, now called Myanmar, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, and the islands of Bali, Timor, and Java. Around the same time, the Japanese sank 12 Allied ships off the Australian cities of Darwin and Broome. The Australian mainland remained untouched for the time being, as the Imperial forces maintained their focus in ongoing conflicts elsewhere and targeted additional islands including Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. Some of these campaigns were more successful than others, but Japan's determination to conquer remained terrifyingly consistent. One of the Imperial military's first major setbacks came in the first week of May during its attempt to capture the Papuan capital of Port Moresby from the Allies. By then, Japan had long had its eye on Port Moresby. A victory would severely disrupt Allied supply lines in the region and will enable the Japanese to establish a base from which to launch additional attacks on Australia. But American and Australian forces fiercely defended the harbour, and after several days of fighting, Japan abandoned its mission. The attack on Sydney Harbour. The failed invasion of Port Moresby was a letdown for the Japanese, but it certainly didn't stop them from continuing along their path of conquest. Just weeks later, on the night of May 31, 1942, 3 Ko-Hayoteki-class midget submarines entered Sydney Harbour, with each carrying a 2-man crew. After successfully avoiding the partially constructed Sydney Harbour anti-submarine boom net, the trio of vessels attempted to sink Allied warships. 2 of the submarines, M14 and M21, were detected before they could do any damage. The M14's crew deliberately scuttled their vessel, while the M21 was successfully sunk by the Allies. Rather than face the humiliation of defeat, the M21's crew took their own lives. The third midget sub, M24, tried unsuccessfully to torpedo the American heavy cruiser USS Chicago, but its crew managed to sink the Royal Australian Navy ship HMAS Kutebal, killing 21 sailors and wounding 10 others. The Dutch submarine KIX was damaged by a torpedo during the raid. Nearly 2 months later, it was decommissioned from the Royal Netherlands Navy. The vessel underwent extensive repairs and was commissioned into the Royal Australian Navy under the name HMAS K9 nearly a year later. At the end of the day, there was no real winner of the skirmish. While the Allies suffered greater casualties, it would be fair to say that the attack on Sydney Harbour wasn't as successful as the Japanese had hoped it would be. All 3 midget submarines and their combined 6 crew members were lost in the raid, in addition to several losses that the Japanese incurred shortly before the attack. The Imperial Navy originally planned to carry out the raid using 6 larger submarines, which made up what was known as the Eastern Attack Group on the 8th Submarine Squadron. On May 11th, roughly 3 weeks before the attack, 4 of the submarines were dispatched to the Japanese base at Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands, with instructions to each pick up a midget submarine. One of the larger submarines was torpedoed on its way to Truk by the American sub USS Tautog. One of the fleet's 5 remaining submarines was forced to return to Truk within a day of leaving for Sydney, when the battery compartment in the midget submarine it was transporting exploded, destroying the midget and killing its pilot. After picking up a replacement midget sub, the larger vessel rejoined the 4 other mother submarines in the waters off Sydney. After the attack, midget subs M14 and M21 were recovered shortly after the attack on Sydney Harbour. The remains of the vessel's 4 crew members were cremated and treated with full naval honours in hopes that it would compel the Japanese government to treat its Australian prisoners of war more humanely. The M24's fate remained unknown for 64 years. The mystery was finally solved in 2006 when scuba divers discovered the wrecked submarine off Sydney's northern beaches. Despite their shortcomings, the Imperial forces remained undeterred. The 5 mother submarines waited for 3 days for the midget submarines to return following the attack. When it became evident that they'd most likely met with disaster, the crews of the larger subs refocused their efforts, embarking on a month-long campaign to disrupt merchant shipping in the waters off Eastern Australia. At least 7 Allied merchant ships were attacked in the weeks following the Sydney Harbour raid. 3 vessels were sunk and 50 sailors were killed. Roughly a week after the failed attack on Sydney, on the morning of June 8th, 2 of the Japanese subs bombarded the ports at Sydney and Newcastle. The attacks began shortly after midnight, when the Japanese submarine I-24 surfaced 9 miles off the Sydney coast and fired 10 shells over a 4-minute period. 9 of the shells landed in Sydney's eastern suburbs, while the 10th landed in the water. Thankfully, only 1 of them detonated. But no lives were lost, and the shelling resulted only in minor injuries like cuts and fractures, which were caused by broken glass, falling bricks, and other damage to homes and other buildings that were struck by the unexploded shells. A few hours later, at around 2:15 in the morning, submarine I-21 shelled Newcastle from a little more than 5.5 miles offshore. The crew fired 34 shells over a 16-minute period in an attempt to destroy a major steelworks facility. Much like the earlier attack, only 1 of the shells detonated, causing damage to a house, while an unexploded shell struck a tram terminal. There were no deaths or major injuries. To this day, the 2 raids on Sydney and the bombardment of Newcastle were the only attacks on the cities to occur in recorded history. During the attack on Newcastle, the Australian military returned fire from a coastal defence installation at Fort Scratchley, marking the only time in history that an Australian land fortification fired on an enemy warship during wartime. The submarine was undamaged. A lucky outcome. The outcomes of the attack on Sydney Harbour and the bombardments that followed could have turned out much worse for the Allies. Historians have been quick to point out that the Japanese paid a relatively large price in the form of lost submarines and wasted efforts in exchange for minimal gains. And while any loss of life is undeniably tragic, the destruction of 3 Allied merchant ships and a Royal Australian Navy vessel did little, if anything, to change the big picture. The Allies were doubly fortunate for the fact that they experienced minimal setbacks despite doing an arguably poor job at responding to the attacks. They weren't prepared for the raid on Sydney Harbour or the ensuing bombardments, nor were they expecting any of it, even though the warning signs were there. Prior to the attack, there were numerous warnings of Japanese activity off Australia's east coast, yet the Allied forces who were tasked with protecting the shoreline failed to take appropriate action. Instead, they ignored the red flags or came up with explanations pointing away from the possibility of an impending Japanese attack. Even high-ranking naval officers who were in the area on the night of the attack shirked any notion of an imminent raid. In the hours leading up to the attack, Royal Navy Rear Admiral Gerard Charles Muirhead Gould hosted a dinner party. One of the main guests was Captain Howard Bode of the USS Chicago, the highest-ranking US Navy officer stationed in Sydney Harbour at the time. Both men reportedly doubted that an attack was in the works. Around midnight, Muirhead Gould boarded the Royal Navy vessel HMAS Lolita. He later said he was trying to learn more details about the situation at hand, but crew members claimed that he chastised them for reporting their suspicions of a Japanese raid. Junior officers aboard the USS Chicago made similar allegations toward Captain Bode, and members of both crews accused the men of being drunk. The officers finally began to take the claims of an attack seriously after the HMAS Kutebul was torpedoed. In addition to what's been described as the incompetent leadership of Mirhed Gould and Bode, some historians also blame poor communication for the flawed Allied response to the raid. Even after the Japanese midget submarine M14 was spotted in the harbor, more than 2 hours passed before Mirhed Gould issued the first order for the ships under his command to carry out anti-submarine actions. It took 2 more hours for the Navy to mobilize its auxiliary patrol boats and another hour for the vessels to leave their anchorage area. None of the boats were equipped with radio communications, forcing their operators to rely on signal lights and smaller boats for further instruction. The unseen damage. All things considered, luck undoubtedly played a role in the lack of death and destruction that the Allies experienced during the attacks on Sydney and Newcastle. So, it's easy to assume that everyone in the immediate area breathed a collective sigh of relief once all was said and done. But not all of the damage inflicted by violence is physical. In fact, the effects of the midget submarine attack and the ensuing bombardments were mostly psychological. Prior to the initial raid on Sydney Harbour, Australians weren't overly worried about the prospect of an attack on the country's soil. Some experts have even described the overall consensus as a feeling of immunity to violence at the hands of the Japanese or other Axis powers. For the first several years of the war, the fighting took place in areas that felt an entire world away from Australia. But as the war in the Pacific expanded, the threat of a Japanese attack on the country increased substantially. In hindsight, some might have even argued that the violence against the nation was a predictable part of Japan's plans for conquest throughout the Pacific. Most people remained blissfully unconcerned about the looming danger that was encroaching upon the region, and the reality of the situation didn't sink in until enemy fire struck the mainland. This false sense of safety may seem deliberately ignorant, but it's actually understandable, and civilians weren't necessarily at fault for their lack of fear. For example, mainstream news didn't travel as fast or as far back then as it does today. The midget submarine attack on Sydney wasn't mentioned in the newspaper until more than a day after it occurred, because on the morning of the attack, that day's edition of the paper had already been written up and slated for publication. Any mention of the raid that appeared in newspapers the following day was brief, vague, and tucked inconspicuously into the inner pages. To give you an idea, the loss of the HMAS Kutebul was described as one small harbour vessel of no military value. There was no mention of the 21 lives lost, courtesy of a strictly imposed federal censorship banning the disclosure of what really happened. Meanwhile, the front page featured a distracting headline about the Royal Air Force's successful bombing of the German city of Cologne. People were certainly not ignorant or unaware of the fact that a very large, destructive and deadly war was taking place. But the Australian government's heavy-handed control over the media's disclosure of information begs the question of how much the country's citizens actually knew about what was going on in the Pacific arena and elsewhere throughout the globe. In an era without cell phones, the internet, or more than a handful of cable TV channels, civilians had fewer ways of obtaining information than a person in today's world can probably imagine. If the threat posed by the Japanese wasn't mentioned in their news sources, then it makes sense that the vast majority of people continue to live their lives in a way that may seem naive or even flippant from the outside looking in. Regardless of whether or not they should have seen it coming, the attacks traumatized civilians and dramatically altered their perception of the war and the dangers it posed. Throughout the remainder of the conflict, Australia's citizens remained on high alert amid ever-heightening fears that the Japanese would eventually return to wreak havoc on Australia's coastal cities. Thankfully, that didn't happen. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time. Bye.